Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 35, Baseball, Marion Sims, and the American-Mexican War. So you know all the leftist propaganda that college professors are here to brainwash you with? Well, here it is. Pay attention, comrade. Historical materialism is a methodology used by scientific socialists and Marxist historiographers to understand human societies and their development through history, arguing that historical, social, and structural changes result from material and technological conditions rather than ideals. In seeking the causes of products and changes in human society, historical materialism focuses on how humans collectively produce the necessities of life. Historical materialism builds upon the idea of historical progress that became popular in philosophy during the Enlightenment, which asserted that the development of human society has progressed through a series of stages, from hunting and gathering, through pastoralism and cultivation, to commercial culture. Historical materialism springs from a fundamental underlying reality of human existence, that from subsequent generations of humans being able to survive, they must produce and reproduce the materials required of everyday life. To summarize, history develops by the following observations. Social progress is driven by improvement in the materials, productive forces a society has at its disposal. Humans are inevitably involved in productive relations, which constitutes our most socially solid relations. These relations progress with the development of productive forces. They are primarily determined by the division of labor, which tends to select a social class. Production relations are determined by the means and forces of production and set the conditions for their development. For example, capitalism tends to increase the rate at which the forces develop and stresses capital accumulation. The relations of production define the mode of production. For example, the capitalist mode of production is characterized by the polarization of society into capitalists and workers. The superstructure, the cultural and institutional features of a community, its ideological materials, is ultimately an expression of the mode of production on which the society is founded. Every type of state is a powerful institution of the ruling class. The state is an instrument that one class uses to secure its rule and enforce its preferred relations of production and exploitation onto society. State power is usually only transferred from one type to another by social and political upheaval. When a given relation of productions no longer supports further progress in the productive forces, either further progress is strangled or revolution must occur. The actual historical process is not predetermined but depends on class struggle, especially the elevation of class consciousness and organization of the working class. Historians have critiqued such claims as explanatory power or valid applications of historical materialism by arguing that it could explain or explain away any fact brought before it, making it unfalsifiable and thus pseudo-scientific. Some have compared historical materialism to the Turk. This 18th century device was promoted as a mechanized automaton that could defeat skilled chess players but conceal a human who controlled the machine. Despite Marx's claim of scientific objectivity, historical materialism was just quasi-religious. Like the Turk, the puppet called historical materialism is always supported to win. It can do this with no further ado against any opponent, so long as it employs the service of theology, which, as everyone knows, is small and ugly and must be kept out of sight. Others argue that the historical materialism is a highly exaggerated claim. They observed that it was clear to many Marxists that society's social, cultural, and ideological superstructure was not under the control of the base, but had at least some degree of autonomy. It was also clear that the phenomenon of the social superstructure could be determined part of the economic base. Thus, historians argue that Marxists moved from a claim of the dominance of the monetary base to a scenario in which the base sometimes determines the superstructure and the superstructure sometimes decides the base, which historians argue destroys their whole position. This is because this new claim is so innocuous that no one would deny it, whereas the old claim was very radical as it postulated the dominance of economics. Historians argue that Marxists should have abandoned historical materialism when its robust version became untenable, but instead they chose to water it down until it became a trivial claim. Historical materialism seems to lay atop the ash heap of history. Baseball. The evolution of baseball from older bat and ball games is difficult to trace with precision. Consensus once held that today's baseball is a North American development from the older game rounders, popular among children in Great Britain and Ireland. American baseball historians suggest that the name originated in England. Recently uncovered historical evidence supports this position. Some historians argue that rounders and early baseball were regional variants of each other, and the game's most direct antecedents are the English games of stool ball and tut ball. The earliest known references to baseball is in a 1744 British publication, A Little Pretty Pocketbook by John Newbery. Historians discovered that the first recorded game of baseball took place in 1749 in Surrey and featured the Prince of Wales. This early form of the game was brought to Canada by English immigrants. By the early 1830s, there was reports of a variety of uncodified bat and ball games recognizable as early forms of baseball being played around North America. The first officially recorded baseball game in North America was played in Beachville, Ontario, Canada on June 4, 1838. In 1845, Alexander Cartwright, a member of New York City's Knickerbocker Club, led the codification of the so-called Knickerbocker Rules, which were based on rules developed in 1837 by William R. Wheaton of the Gotham Club. While there are reports that the New York Knickerbockers played games in 1845, the contest, long recognized as the first officially recorded baseball game in U.S. history, took place on June 19, 1846, in Hoboken, New Jersey. The New York Nine defeated the Knickerbockers 23-1 in 4 innings. The New York Herald becomes the first newspaper to mention the game of baseball. The same year, Alexander Cartwright and his New York Knickerbockers baseball team codified the rules of baseball for the first time, including 9 men per side. With the Knickerbocker Code as the basis, the rules of modern baseball continued to evolve over the next half-century. In the mid-1850s, a baseball craze hit the New York metropolitan area, and by 1856, local journals referred to baseball as the national pastime or national game. The sport's first governing body, the National Association of Baseball Players, was formed a year later. In 1867, it barred participation by African Americans. The more formally structured National League was founded in 1876. Professional Negro leagues formed but quickly folded. In 1887, softball, under indoor baseball and indoor-outdoor, was invented as a winter version of the parent game. The National League's first successful counterparts, the American League, which evolved into the minor Western League, was established in 1893, and virtually all of the modern baseball rules were in place by then.
The Morton Rule. The Morton Rule is any variant of the 1840s jury instruction in a criminal case with the defense of insanity. The law was formulated as a reaction to the acquittal in 1843 of Daniel Morton on the charge of murdering Edward Drummond. Morton had shot Drummond after mistakenly identifying him as UK Prime Minister Robert Peel, the intended target. The House of Lords asked a panel of judges, presided over by Sir Nicholas Conyngham Tyndall, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, a series of hypothetical questions about the defense of insanity. The principles expounded by this panel have come to be known as the Norton Rules, though they have gained any status only by usage in the common law, and Merton himself would have been found guilty if they had been applied at his trial. The rules so formulated as Norton's case have been a standard test for criminal liability about mentally disordered defendants in common law jurisdictions ever since, with some minor adjustments. When the tests set out by the rules are satisfied, the accused may be sentenced not guilty because of insanity or guilty but insane, and the sentence may be a mandatory or discretionary period of treatment in a secure hospital facility, or otherwise at the discretion of the court instead of punitive disposal. The Norton Rule was first applied by the courts in the United States in the 19th century, just a few years after the British ruling. The Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law reported how in 1846, New York State tried William Freeman. He was accused of killing several members of the Van Nest family near Auburn, New York. Freeman demonstrated psychotic behavior. He was obsessed with horse theft and false imprisonment. William Seward, his defense lawyer, wanted an insanity verdict, and used the Norton Rule argument. Although Freeman was impaired, a jury found him competent to stand trial. A jury found Freeman guilty of the killings, and a judge sentenced him to death. Seward filed a writ of error. The New York State Supreme Court reversed Freeman's conviction and death sentence. The court said the Norton Rule would be the standard in New York. This rule was adopted and used in the United States court system. However, there were many criticisms about this rule both in the United States and back in England. This rule did three things that made it critically insufficient as an insanity test. The rule is not in accord with psychiatric knowledge. The rule does not permit complete and adequate testimony. The psychiatric expert testifying under the rule does not make a scientific contribution, but assumes the role of an ethical judge. Due to this and other circumstances, the rule in America would be deemed for change. The insanity defense is recognized in Australia, Canada, England, and Wales, Hong Kong, India, the Republic of Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, and most US states, except for Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Utah, and Vermont. However, not all these jurisdictions still use the Norton Rules. States that disallow the insanity defense still allow defendants to demonstrate that they cannot form the intent to commit a crime due to mental illness.
J. Marion Sims. Few medical doctors have been as lauded and loathed as James Marion Sims. Credited as the father of modern gynecology, Sims developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health. In 1876, he was named president of the American Medical Association, and in 1880, he became president of the American Gynecological Society, an organization he helped found. The 19th century physician has been praised with a half-dozen statues around the country. But because Sims' research was conducted on enslaved black women without anesthesia, medical ethicists, historians, and others say his use of enslaved black bodies as medical test subjects falls into a long, ethically bereft history that includes the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and Henrietta Lacks. Critics say Sims cared more about the investigations than in providing treatment. He caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that black people did not feel pain. Sims, who practiced medicine when treating women was considered distasteful and rarely done, invented the vaginal speculum, a tool used for dilation and examination. He also pioneered a surgical technique to repair vesicovaginal fistula, a typical 19th century complication of childbirth in which a tear between the uterus and bladder caused constant pain and urine leakage. His defenders say the Southern-born slaveholder was simply a man of his time for whom the end justified the means, and that enslaved women with fistulas were likely to have wanted the treatment badly enough that they would have agreed to take part in his experiments. But history hasn't recorded their voices, and consent from their owners, who had a substantial financial interest in their recovery, was the only legal requirement of the time. Born in Lancaster County, South Carolina, in 1813, James Marion Sims entered the medical profession when doctors didn't undergo the same rigorous coursework and training they do today. After interning with a doctor, taking a 3-month course, and studying for a year at Jefferson Medical College, Sims began his practice in Lancaster. He later relocated to Montgomery, Alabama, seeking a fresh start after the death of his first 2 patients. In Montgomery, Sims built his reputation among wealthy, white plantation owners by treating their enslaved workers. Sims's practice was deeply rooted in the trade for enslaved people. Sims built an 8-person hospital in the heart of the trading district in Montgomery. While most healthcare took place on the plantations, some stubborn cases were brought to physicians like Sims, who patched up enslaved workers so they could produce and reproduce for their masters again. Otherwise, they were useless to their owners. This brings up the concept of soundness. Being sound meant they produce, for men and women, and reproduce, for women. For these women, having this fistula made them less sound. Like most doctors in the 19th century, Sims originally had little interest in treating female patients, and no specific gynecological training. Indeed, examining and treating female organs was widely considered offensive and unsavory. But his interest in treating women changed when he was asked to help a patient who had fallen off a horse and was suffering from pelvic and back pain. To treat this woman's injury, Sims realized he needed to look directly into her vagina. He positioned her on all fours, leaning forward, and then used his fingers to help him see inside. This discovery allowed him to develop the precursor to the modern speculum, the bent handle of a pewter spoon. From his examination, Sims could see that the patient had a vesicovaginal fistula. Sims began experimenting in 1845 with surgical techniques to treat such fistulas with no known cure for the ailment. If the patient's owners provided clothing and paid taxes, Sims effectively took temporary ownership of the women until their treatment was completed. He later reflected in his autobiography The Story of My Life on the advantages he found to work on people that were essentially his property. There was never a time that I could not, at any day, have had a subject for operation. According to Sims, this was the most memorable time of his life. Sims wrote that the women had clamored for the operations to relieve their discomfort, but whether they consented or not was captured in any other historical record. Today, we know 3 of the names of the female fistula patients from Sims's own records: Lucy, Anaka, and Betsy. The first one he operated on was 18-year-old Lucy, who had given birth a few months prior and hadn't been able to control her bladder since. She became extremely ill due to his controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine away from the bladder, leading to contract blood poisoning. During the procedure, patients were completely naked and asked to perch on their knees and bend forward onto their elbows, so their heads rested on their hands. Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying out in pain, as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. As Sims later wrote, Lucy's agony was extreme. I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation, he wrote. For a long time, Sims' fistula surgeries were not successful. After 30 operations on one woman, a 17-year-old enslaved woman named Anaka who had had a very traumatic labor and delivery, he finally perfected his method, after 4 years of experimentation. Afterward, he began to practice on white women, using anesthesia, which was new to the medical field at the time. While some doctors didn't trust anesthesia, Sims' decision to not use it, or any other numbing technique, was based on his misguided belief that black people didn't experience pain as white people did. According to a study conducted at the University of Virginia, it's a notion that persists today and published in the April 4, 2016 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Sims's racist beliefs affected more than his gynecological experiments. Before and after his gynecological experiments, he also tested surgical treatments on enslaved black children to treat neonatal tetanus, with little to no success. Sims also believed that African Americans were less intelligent than white people and thought their skulls grew too quickly around their brains. He would operate on African American children using a shoemaker's tool to pry their bones apart and loosen their skulls. In the 1850s, Sims moved to New York and opened the first ever women's hospital, where he continued testing controversial medical treatments on his patients. He did not believe anything was wrong with his methods. When any of Sims's patients died, the blame, according to him, lay squarely with the sloth and ignorance of their mothers and the black midwives who attended them. Sims' practices ignited controversy during his lifetime, says Washington. The medical community debated his methods, and some of his white colleagues even openly objected to his experiments, saying he took things too far. J. Marion Sims continues to loom large in the medical field, celebrated as a medical trailblazer. Statues were erected to him in, among other places, New York City's Central Park, the South Carolina State House, and outside his old medical school, Jefferson University, in Philadelphia. After several years of activism, the Philadelphia statue was moved into storage, and the statue in Central Park was removed on April 17, 2018. Its plaque was to be replaced by one that educates the public on the monument's origins and the controversial, non-consensual medical experiment Sims used on women of color.
Manifest Destiny. Manifest destiny was a widely held cultural belief in the 19th century United States that American settlers would expand across North America. There are three basic themes to manifest destiny: the particular virtues of the American people and their institutions, the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West in the image of the agricultural East, an irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty. This concept was born out of a sense of mission to redeem the old world by high example generated by the potentialities of a new earth for building a new heaven. In contemporary historiography, many have condemned manifest destiny as an ideology used to justify genocide against Native Americans. Historians have emphasized that manifest destiny was a contested concept. Democrats endorsed the idea, but many prominent Americans such as Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and most Whigs rejected it. American imperialism did not represent an American consensus, it provoked bitter dissent within the national polity. Whigs saw America's moral mission as one of democratic example rather than one of conquest. Manifest destiny, vast in program, in its sense of continentalism, was slight in support from the outset. It lacked national, sectional, or party following commensurate with its magnitude. The reason was it did not reflect the national spirit. The thesis that it embodied nationalism, found in much historical writing, is backed by little objective supporting evidence. Newspaper editor John O'Sullivan is generally credited with coining the term manifest destiny in 1845 to describe the essence of this mindset. Other historians believe journalist and annexation advocate Jane Casno wrote the unsigned editorial titled Annexation in which it first appeared. Democrats used the term in the 1840s to justify the Mexican-American War, and Americans also used it to negotiate the Oregon boundary dispute. Manifest destiny continually limped along because of its internal limitations and slavery in the United States and never became a national priority. By 1843, former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, originally a major supporter of the concept underlying manifest destiny, had changed his mind and repudiated expansionism, because it meant expanding slavery in Texas. There was never a set of principles defining manifest destiny, it was always a general idea rather than a specific policy made with a motto. Ill-defined but keenly felt, manifest destiny was an expression of conviction in the morality and value of expansionism that complemented other popular ideas of the era, including American exceptionalism and romantic nationalism. Andrew Jackson, who spoke of extending the area of freedom, typified the conflation of America's potential greatness, the nation's budding sense of romantic self-identity, and its expansion. Yet Jackson would not be the only president to elaborate on the principles underlying manifest destiny. Due to the lack of a definitive narrative outlining its rationale, proponents offered divergent or seemingly conflicting viewpoints. While many writers focused primarily on American expansionism, whether into Mexico or across the Pacific, others saw the term as a call to an example. Politicians never resolved these conflicting views of America's destiny without an agreed-upon interpretation, much less an elaborated political philosophy. A vast complex of ideas, policies, and actions is comprehended by manifest destiny. As we should expect, they are not all compatible, nor do they come from any one source. Journalist John L. O'Sullivan was an influential advocate for Jacksonian democracy and a complex character, described by Julian Hawthorne as always full of grand and world-embracing schemes. O'Sullivan wrote an article in 1839 that, while not using the term manifest destiny, did predict a divine destiny for the United States based upon values such as equality, rights of conscience, and personal enfranchisement to establish on earth the moral dignity and salvation of man. This destiny was not explicitly territorial, but O'Sullivan predicted that the United States would be a union of many republics sharing those values. 6 years later, in 1845, O'Sullivan wrote another essay titled Annexation in the Democratic Review, in which he first used the phrase manifest destiny. In this article, he urged the U.S. to annex the Republic of Texas, not only because Texas desired this, but because it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Overcoming Whig opposition, Democrats annexed Texas in 1845. O'Sullivan's first usage of the phrase manifest destiny attracted little attention. O'Sullivan's second use of the phrase became highly influential. On December 27, 1845, in his newspaper, the New York Morning News, O'Sullivan addressed the ongoing boundary dispute with Britain. O'Sullivan argued that the United States had the right to claim the whole of Oregon. That is, O'Sullivan believed that Providence had given the United States a mission to spread republican democracy. The British government would not spread democracy, thought O'Sullivan. British claims to the territory should be overruled. O'Sullivan believed that manifest destiny was a moral ideal, a higher law, that superseded other considerations. O'Sullivan's original conception of manifest destiny was not a call for territorial expansion by force. He believed that the development of the United States would happen without the direction of the US government or the involvement of the military. After Americans immigrated to new regions, they would set up new democratic governments and then seek admission to the United States, as Texas had done. In 1845, O'Sullivan predicted that California would follow this pattern next and that Canada would eventually request annexation. He disapproved of the Mexican-American War in 1846, although he believed that the outcome would be beneficial to both countries. Ironically, O'Sullivan's term became popular only after Whig opponents of the Polk administration criticized it. Whigs denounced manifest destiny, arguing that the designers and supporters of schemes of conquest, to be carried on by this government, are engaged in treason to our Constitution and Declaration of Rights, giving aid and comfort to the enemies of republicanism, in that they are advocating and preaching the doctrine of the right of conquest. On January 3, 1846, Representative Robert Winthrop ridiculed the concept in Congress, saying, "I suppose the right of a manifest destiny to spread will not be admitted to exist in any nation except the universal Yankee nation." Winthrop was the first in a long line of critics who suggested that advocates of manifest destiny were citing divine providence to justify actions motivated by chauvinism and self-interest. Despite this criticism, expansionists embraced the phrase, which caught on so quickly that its origin was soon forgotten. On December 2, 1845, President Polk invoked the concept of manifest destiny, announcing to Congress that the Monroe Doctrine should be strictly enforced and that the settlement of the West should be aggressively pursued.
Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War marked the first U.S. armed conflict chiefly fought on foreign soil. It pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico against the expansionist-minded administration of U.S. President James K. Polk, who believed the United States had a manifest destiny to spread across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. A border skirmish along the Rio Grande started the fighting and was followed by a series of U.S. victories. When the dust cleared, Mexico had lost about one-third of its territory, including nearly all of present-day California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, the United States declined to incorporate it into the Union, mainly because northern political interests were against a new slave state. The Mexican government also encouraged border raids and warned that any attempt at annexation would lead to war. Nonetheless, Americans quickly initiated annexation procedures after the 1844 election of Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be re-annexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Polk also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of today, the U.S. Southwest. When his offer to purchase those lands was rejected, he instigated a fight by moving troops into a disputed zone between the Rio Grande and Nueces River that both countries had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen. They then laid siege to an American fort along the Rio Grande. Taylor called in reinforcements and with the help of superior rifles and artillery defeated the Mexicans at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Following those battles, Polk told the U.S. Congress that the cup of forbearance has been exhausted, even before Mexico passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. 2 days later, on May 13, Congress declared war, despite opposition from some northern lawmakers. No official declaration of war ever came from Mexico. At that time, only about 75,000 Mexican citizens lived north of the Rio Grande. As a result, U.S. forces led by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny and Commodore Robert F. Stockton could conquer those lands with minimal resistance. Taylor likewise had little trouble advancing, and he captured Monterrey in September. With the losses adding up, Mexico turned to old standby General Antonio López de Santa Anna, the charismatic strongman living in exile in Cuba. Santa Anna convinced Polk that he would end the war on terms favorable to the United States if allowed to return to Mexico. But when he arrived, he immediately double-crossed Polk by taking control of the Mexican army and leading it into battle. At the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, Santa Anna suffered heavy casualties and withdrew. Despite the loss, he assumed the Mexican presidency the following month. Meanwhile, U.S. troops led by General Winfield Scott landed in Veracruz and took over the city. They then began marching toward Mexico City, following the same route that Hernán Cortés followed when he invaded the Aztec Empire. The Mexicans resisted at Cerro Gordo and elsewhere but were bested each time. In September 1847, Scott successfully laid siege to Mexico City's Chapultepec Castle. During that clash, a group of military school cadets, the so-called Niños Héroes, purportedly committed suicide rather than surrender. Guerrilla attacks against U.S. supply lines continued, but the war had ended for all intents and purposes. Santa Anna resigned, and the United States waited for a new government capable of negotiations to form. Finally, on February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, establishing the Rio Grande and not the Nueces River as the U.S.-Mexican border. Under the treaty, Mexico also recognized the U.S. annexation of Texas. It agreed to sell California and the rest of its territory north of the Rio Grande for $15 million plus the assumption of certain damages claims.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.